2, 1. Hey, everybody. Hello, Facebook. We are here on Ask the Attorney with episode number 2 with Mark Mandell. Myself, I'm Doug Cohen. I'm the host of the show. Thank you for joining. We are live today as we are recording this. This will be in the feed for you to watch on replay, but today we are going to be talking about some really important topics with addiction, especially for teens. It's prom season, it's graduation season, and when it comes to alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, and even the opioid epidemic, it's a really important topic, and hopefully we'll get some information that you can use to help educate yourselves and be a voice for change and be a part of some positive change, because it is a crisis. And we have 2 people here today. Mark, obviously, this is his channel, Mark Mandell, attorney at law, who is on the front lines of some of these topics, and also a very special guest, one of the founders of Unite to Face Addiction Michigan, Scott Macy. And I'm going to bring these 2 fellows in right now. Here they are. Hey, Mark and Scott, how you guys doing?
Good morning, Doug.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. You guys were both on the steps of the Capitol building recently for the Unite to Face Addiction Michigan rally, right? And I know you talked about opioid addiction, and I know that there's a lot of other topics that we want to cover today. Scott, as an outreach specialist, talk to us a little bit about some of the things that are going on that we need to know, and some of the things you're seeing when it comes to alcohol, marijuana, nicotine addiction in today's teens.
How much time we got? Good.
Right.
When you start talking about those issues, I mean, you have to first, number one, understand that the disease of addiction and its systemic aspects are all about family and community. This disease and the issues that surround it just encapsulates the family. Takes, like we say, as someone that is in recovery myself, we take hostages through our use. And what the kids are seeing is really troubling from the standpoint is that we are priming the adolescent brain for addiction currently, with a lot of the different things that they're being introduced to earlier and earlier in their childhood, mostly when it comes to stimulants like caffeine, nicotine currently, and then also, with prescription medications.
So, Scott, you invited me a couple of weeks ago to speak up at the Capitol for the Unite to Face Addiction rally.
Yeah.
And in essence, a quick note version of what the rally is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was our second year that we've done the rally, and thanks so much to Mark for, coming and providing his perspective for the second year. And what was really important about what we tried to do is we tried to bring awareness. That's the biggest key, is bring awareness. We do it on a weekday up at the Capitol because we know that the legislators are in session, and they're going to be, they're going to be almost a captivated audience to hear and see the people that are struggling with this issue, that have experienced this issue. So awareness is a big piece, and with awareness comes education. And right now, that's what's so important, is just to continue to educate families about the issues that our community sees.
So, Doug, if I could ask Scott, when you asked me to come up there and speak on the Capitol, one of your missions with UFAD is specifically prevention. And you had asked me, over 20 years of practicing law as a criminal defense lawyer, as a divorce attorney, and as a former prosecuting attorney, sort of what, as it relates to underage substance abuse, I see. And in my opinion, it was sort of a ladder, often historically starting off with alcohol, nicotine/tobacco, moving up the ladder to marijuana, and then ultimately prescription pills and heroin. But one of the things that you and I discussed was it doesn't necessarily happen in that order anymore. You and I were in high school in the 80s, and it seems like alcohol was the starter drug, but that's not necessarily the case right now. the one thing that I emphasize up at the state capitol is there were some specific words that I think really hit home as it related to parents, kids, and the education. And that was, unfortunately, arrogance, ignorance, and invincibility were three words specifically. So with that said, I was sort of hoping you could just maybe briefly touch on the topic of alcohol and why it's illegal when you're under 21, because there's been scientific proof about the brain, and then move right into the nicotine, the vaping, and sort of go from there. So one step at a time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you look at the progression, you always got to be able to kind of paint the picture of progression. Like we in recovery, we always talk about playing the tape through. And at a young age, we don't have that ability. The brain is developing, and through the use of, not only illicit drugs, but other socially acceptable drugs that, that just alter the brain and our ability to process, starting with alcohol, leading to marijuana, prescription medications. It just makes, the cognitive aspects of making decisions are harder. Understanding the responsibilities or the ramifications of your actions by the use of these issues, of these drugs. So through the progression of the use of these drugs, we're seeing things happen a lot quicker. I always talk about the collapsing time frame of addiction amongst adolescents, and plus because of it's happening at a younger age, at a quicker pace. It affects the family even at a larger, in a larger way.
So if I can interrupt you right there, one of the words we touched on, and I'm a father, so I have to have these discussions with my own kids. But it's sort of the ignorance. Often, and Doug, it's graduation season, it's prom season. The kids are running wild. Not all, obviously, but it's that time of the year.
Right.
So I get a lot of phone calls about minor in possession or possession of marijuana, and I'm astonished when I sit down with the kids and their parents, the naiveness or the ignorance of what the court is expecting when you do get in trouble. And we're talking, drug testing, whether it's Novi or Plymouth courts or Bloomfield, or all the way downriver. You could be facing testing 3-4 times a week. And I'm a little always surprised about the cavalier approach of the parents as it relates to even condoning this behavior. So if you could touch on that.
Yeah. Well, just in treatment, working in treatment like I do, we see, the dynamic is troubling, but the dynamic that we see is a lot of parents using with their kids, and it's that's troubling in just that regard. But some of the issues. We have kids socializing kids. We have kids growing up making adult decisions at very young ages. Just this past week, the two issues I've had to deal with my teenage daughters, 13 and 15, is one. I have a younger daughter who just doesn't understand the significance of some of the socialization aspects of, for example, she's wearing a hat. We're such a socially driven. We're so socially driven. Our media is so socially driven, and the way our kids are brought up. She's making light of, a marijuana hat that she's wearing with a friend that, with, marijuana leaves and sayings on it. And then my other daughter's dealing with issues regarding, not being invited, out, with all her friends because they want to vape and they know her stance on vape being introduced to it. And what I mean by vape is, it's a big thing that's happening in our middle schools and our high schools, where kids are being introduced to nicotine through e-cigarettes and vape pens. My daughter in sixth grade, she had 3 kids on her bus expelled for using vape pens in.
Scott, why don't you explain to us Doug and I had this conversation just a week ago. This vaping just sort of is in the last 2 to 4 years, like come out of nowhere. And I was unaware of vaping myself up until just, again, about 2 years ago. But what is vaping? Explain to us the nicotine and how kids are getting involved in it. And Doug, you had asked me this question recently.
If I could add to that too, Scott, a little bit just on the vaping thing. I think I'm getting a little echo. Sorry about that. The vaping thing. Talk a little bit about, number one, the fact that it seems like it's easier to get away with it because of the lack of smell and smoke, and maybe the perception that it's not dangerous because there isn't smoke involved. I think those are two topics when it comes to the vaping that I think are kind of pervasive out there. I think it impacts how easy it is to do, and the fact that people might not take it as seriously because they don't think it's dangerous because there's not actual, smoke that you think about when you smoke a cigarette.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest things, and the more I study this and the more I talk to people, is that, I think we're using the wrong word when we talk vape, because it's actually an aerosol that you are inhaling and exhaling. And then the number of different chemicals, even because there's different types of products available. I mean, yes, there's the nicotine, and then now we got, with the marijuana and the extracts, we got the dabbing, but we got the e-liquid that they call it, that they think is just a vapor, and it's not. It's an aerosol, and it's there's quite a few chemicals that are involved in it. As well, the apparatus that's used, or the vaporizer, is very dangerous because it's got to be heated up to almost 400 degrees to atomize the vape product. And we've seen a lot of explosions as well because it's not regulated. But, the big thing is for someone that grew up in the 80s, I mean, when we were introduced to tobacco. Today, it's nicotine. And it's nicotine at 5.0. It's at a higher milligram, the way it's assimilated into the body, and that. So,
Scott, how would you describe the difference of the nicotine that is in like a Marlboro Light? So when I was growing up in the 80s, graduated from North Farmington, the smoking was, people would be outside the school smoking cigarettes. And that's what I think about cigarettes and nicotine. But how would you compare like a Marlboro Light versus somebody that's inhaling through the vapor?
Well, the biggest aspect is the way that it's absorbed into the body. It's absorbed a lot quicker and at a much higher potency, depending on, there are levels of potency for the products that could be purchased. But there's studies that show through tobacco use or a cigarette and through a vape pen, the way that it's assimilated into the body, the concentration is a lot higher for vaping.
That's scary.
And what about, like I'm seeing through the grapevine or discussions with some parents that have approached me, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders are vaping. And the parents, some have a cavalier attitude towards it and are discussing like, well, our kids like to blow circles, literally. Like I'm hearing stories about they have parties and the kids are justifying their action to their parents about what they're doing.
Yeah, it's called, they have a game called cloud chasing. That's what you're describing as cloud chasing. It's a game. That's just, it's more indicated behavior that's attributed to the way we socialize. It's so socially acceptable, the way we, use this, or the way we see it on social media.
All right. And Doug and I were also having this discussion. You had asked me a couple of weeks ago to speak out on the east side as it relates to this ballot initiative about the legalization of marijuana. And, some people are for it, some people are against it. But I thought it would be interesting if you could give your perspective on this ballot initiative first. And then, Doug, I think you're going to ask a follow-up question about the underage marijuana smoking and the THC level. So if you could hit the first one about the ballot,
Yeah.
and the second.
Well, as far as the ballot initiative goes, we have 8 states and the District of Columbia to look at the aspect of how it's working. And the more I talk on this issue, the more I learn about this issue. I just see that there needs to be a more comprehensive approach in discussion. It can't be polarizing. And I think it becomes polarizing when we look at it from, strict A and B views. There's so much to it. And the thing is, the big thing that we have to understand is this generational gap that we have. We have such a huge generational gap in knowledge of what is current and what we were as parents exposed to.
If I can intervene on that point, when we were up at the Capitol, as I described it, because you've been great in educating me over the years on some of these issues, as I said, it's not your dad's grass anymore.
No, I mean, all you have to do, and that's the thing, if I go into a school and I'm talking to kids, I'm trying to empower the kids to make, good choices and to educate themselves, because, where are they getting most of their education? I mean, off of the internet. They're not talking to their mom and dad about it. They're not really getting exposed to it through the school system and the educational system that's set up to educate them about this issue, because, they're afraid to touch this subject. The thing is, there's a lot of information out there. I try to, empower the kids to educate themselves, because, believe me, they want to. I was in a discussion with someone the other day, and we were talking about, the old word prohibition. I hate to use the word prohibition, because just because you have some concerns about the legalization, and that's another thing, I hate to use the word legalization. Let's call it what it is. It's commercialization. I work in treatment. I see 3,500 patients a year, and I always ask the question. Today, after I leave here, I'll be doing some tech talks with over 100 and some patients. And when we talk about marijuana, I ask them, who's had a hard time getting their marijuana? And I haven't come across anybody that has had a hard time getting their marijuana. The thing we need to have a discussion about is maybe the decriminalization of it. Because as we legalize it, or please understand, it's commercialization. And if you know anything about commercialization and the economic framework that comes along with it, we're creating customers. And who are those customers? It's those kids. Because we go back to the vape pen. We've said we're cigarettes smoking is down considerably. Well, they backdoored us. And if you'll see about 1 million kids are going to be introduced to nicotine for the very first time this coming year through vape pens and other ways other than cigarettes and chewing tobacco.
Hey, Scott, on that topic, as a matter of fact, we've got a question from the audience here. Jennifer wants to know if there is a legal age for vaping.
Well, my understanding that there is not. To purchase the product, there is not. If you can purchase, the atomizer or the vape, but the product that you use, because if it's got nicotine in it, there is an age requirement. But the thing is, a lot of the things that are being sold, educate yourself. Go into the party stores, go into the gas stations, and look at the products that are being sold. They're being sold over the counter. They're right there. And some of the names of the products are, fruit punch. Just the other day, I went to pick up my daughter at the high school she goes to, in an affluent community. And, I was walking, the parking lot, and I picked up about 3 different bottles of nicotine juice that's used for vape pens.
Scott, on that second question that I wanted you to touch on, the THC level. If you could explain a little bit about the THC level. Like, when I think of marijuana, I think of it as just grass, but it can come in a wax form. All kinds of people, legally, maybe distributing it and growing it themselves. But how do you differentiate? Like, everybody knows that Bud Light has X amount of alcohol level in it, and bourbon has Y amount of alcohol level in it. So when it's coming to marijuana, how are we differentiating how much THC?
We're not. And that's the scary part, because, you could say, well, you have proof levels in your liquor and you have alcohol levels in your beer and wine that we regulate. Well, let's be careful, because if you look at the legislation, and this is why the legislation, it's scary. You wonder who wrote some of this legislation, because there is a caveat in the legislation that allows you to grow your own weed up to 6 plants, and you can get a waiver up to 12 plants in the way the legislation is written now. And if you know anything about cultivating a plant, you can cultivate a marijuana plant up to 3 times in a year. So you're talking about pounds on one plant. And if you're allowed to do 6 plants, you're looking at a huge amount of personal use. And then how are we going to collect revenue on that? But when you're talking about THC, there is no regulation. What happened in this, for example, in Colorado in 2014, when they when they legalized it, went commercial, one thing that really stuck out was that they had over 4,800 retailers that first year selling marijuana. Okay. And when you have 4,800 retailers in Colorado, for example, they had more retailers selling marijuana than they had Starbucks, McDonald's, and 7-Elevens combined. And that didn't even allow for every county allowing the sale of this stuff. So what you had to do is 4,800 retailers, they had to differentiate themselves. And how do they do that? Stronger products. So the THC levels in the states that have legalized is upwards of 300%, 3 times as strong as neighboring states that don't have where we've confiscated weed. So the national average is roughly about 18%. But when you go into states that have legalized, it's upwards of 40%. And that's just the bud. And 70% of the sales coming out of Colorado, it's not bud. It's medibles, or they call edibles, and it's extracts, or the liquid form of weed, the extracted high concentrated THC levels, which gets as high as 90%, sometimes pure THC.
Let me ask you this, Scott, and I've laid it out in, Doug, if you could put up the Fosson Bond website under the criminal section. Every crime that a minor could be charged with, or for that matter, an adult, as it relates to alcohol and or marijuana, the charges are laid out. Specifically, when we're dealing with the underage vaping, I'm not asking this so much scientifically. I'm asking this more as when you're up at Brighton Hospital and you're sitting in some of these prevention groups. Are you seeing a direct correlation from the teenager starting with vaping, nicotine, and then moving into marijuana?
Well, it's just the socialization aspect and the way we just have our views are lowered. Because what's so astonishing to me is that we'll talk about addiction. We understand that addiction it's life or death. I mean, just look at the death rates. We have 150 people a day dying from addiction. That's a plane crashing in this country every day. But at the same time, you talk to kids, they're concerned about some of the dangers, but actually their perception of risk has been dropping for the last 20-some years. It's been dropping.
Why?
And it's just because of the way they have been marketed it to, and their belief system. When I go into a school, and it drives me nuts, a kid is going to first bring up, well, alcohol is legal, and then the second thing they're going to say is you don't die from marijuana. Well, let's try to up our understanding or our perspective. I mean, do you have to die from something for it to be dangerous? And I think our kids are their perspective is a little skewed. So the thing is, the big thing is that this marijuana that we're seeing today, we're guinea pigs. The human brain has never seen levels of THC this high.
And that's kind of scary to me, because I think, it's something that we've always heard and that we've always said, the whole gateway drug thing about, well, if you start doing this, it's going to lead you to do that, and you'll progress from one drug to a worse drug to a worse drug. So,
It couldn't be more
the
evident.
fact that the THC levels are higher,
Yeah.
how much of an impact does that have in terms of that progression, that it leads people to a heavier drug maybe because they're used to a more intense high earlier on? I mean, is there evidence for that?
Yeah, well, big time, because I mean, the progression of addiction has a lot to do with the period of time it takes you to get high and the experience you have on it. For example, I graduated to crack cocaine. I was a cocaine addict, but the way we try to describe it, it's all about the curve. And what we mean by the curve is that the quicker you can get high, that's what people are looking for.
So whether it's alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine,
Yes.
or when we start discussing heroin, it's all the high.
It's the period of time it takes to get high. It's how you get high. It's breaking that blood barrier in the brain to get high. And what happens is that there's a shorter life. There's a shorter lifespan. What we call a half-life. And so what that does is then now it starts the cycle of we're trying to replicate that high. And that's what's really scary, because what we're seeing with vaping and what we're seeing with opiates and heroin is that we're getting higher quicker, but we're not getting higher as longer. We start building tolerance, and then we're just starting on this cycle of addiction, trying to replicate those periods. And one of the biggest things about adolescence that we're finding is that the human brain releases dopamine. When we experience something very pleasurable, dopamine is released, and there's this memory that we have. And you start mostly here in Northville. You have kids that grow up in in a strong community, strong family environment, that excel in academics, that excel in athletics. But all of a sudden, you might have a kid that's exposed to Vicodin or an Oxycontin at a young age, and all of a sudden, within a year or two, they're sticking a needle in their arm, and you're going, "What happened here?" Well, what we're seeing is that some kids, mostly that have a predisposition for addiction, are born with low dopamine or have experienced childhood trauma, and with that, when they use, we're not doing a good job of an assessment on the front end. So the doctors aren't assessing the predisposition for possible dependency or addiction. So it's kind of tough from those regards.
Let's start on that topic as it relates to prescription drugs and heroin. You and I have had many discussions about this over the years, Scott, for about the last 3 or 4, I would say, probably more so than in the past. But as I talk to parents, and I just may be out with some friends, and I've told them over the years, the increase of phone calls I'm getting as it relates to possession of heroin, which goes hand in hand really with stealing. Usually they're coming to my office as a result of stealing from, unfortunately, family members. They usually know who they're stealing from, and it's to feed the addiction. And I've been telling people for the last couple of years, like, the phone rings more to a certain degree than it ever has as it relates to possession of heroin and crimes of theft, going hand in hand. But as it relates to the drunk driving, maybe Uber's eviscerated that to a certain degree, but it seems like I'm getting more calls on heroin. And I found what you have taught me over the years, first how it starts through prescription drugs, then into the heroin. But Doug and I could both probably agree that in our minds growing up, a heroin addict, like, I perceive Doug as somebody like out in San Francisco, down and out, but that is not the case. So if you can, shed some light on the prescription drugs and leading into the heroin and where we are at, because even in the town I live in over the last couple of years, we have had heroin overdoses and kids dying. One in which I coached about 5-6 years ago.
Well, and that's interesting too. My brother's an administrator here in this community, and he'd come and visit me when I was in treatment, and he'd be aghast at, seeing kids that he taught, and it just, he couldn't believe it. But that's the nature of what's going on. I mean, every time I experience a family or someone that has, I just lost, my future stepson lost his fiance to an overdose, that they both overdosed. He came to and found his fiance dead. And, you think you hear it all. And these were 25-year-old kids. But I guess, just recently, Tiger Woods, just the other day, gets pulled over and charged for a possible DUI, driving under the influence. And what we're finding out is that he was under the influence. He's saying he was under the influence of prescription drugs. So we're going to see more and more drugged driving. And that's very troubling. And, people are, they're just not taking the responsibility that comes with either a prescription that's written to them.
And where's the connection between the Vicodin, the prescription drug, and the graduating to heroin? Because in my experience, on multiple occasions, the usual client that's coming into my office started on Vicodin, did not go right to the heroin.
Well, and this is the troubling aspect. 4 out of 5 heroin addicts started with prescription medication. I just, to give you an example, I just picked up a 54-year-old woman in rural Ohio. She had just retired from General Dynamics. I mean, she's got, these are her golden ages. This is what she's supposed to be, just enjoying life. And her doctor quit her after 20 years, up and quit her. She was on pain medication, built a tolerance to it. He didn't know how to really treat her anymore. That's why there needs to be so much training, but it only took 2 weeks before her husband was on the streets of Toledo picking up the heroin that she's shooting. So then I had, so I guess that illustrates, and the story goes on because there was a 70-year-old man that called me from the same area, and he needed the same type of help. But I guess the big thing to understand is these prescriptions are very, very potent and need to be responsibly taken, and there needs to be an education up front and a better.
And with teenagers, and where are you seeing the jump from the pill to the heroin, and why?
Well, I mean, it all depends on where they're starting, but mostly with athletic injuries. Those are the most troubling because these kids, they're going to go to, a doctor, and a doctor's going to prescribe them, a prescription for a painkiller. Look, the United States makes up less than 4.6% of the world's population. We make up less than 5% of the world's population, but we consume 99% of the world's Vicodin, which is hydrocodone, and we consume 85% of the world's opiates. So I guess by me saying that is we have this one size fits all for pain. And when a kid is injured at a young age and he's introduced to these very potent drugs, they're off to the races. They're off to the races depending on, how their brain is wired. And we don't do a good job of looking at and assessing them on the front end.
Doug and I talked on our last Facebook Live show about the actual rate of overdoses in heroin, and I had made note that in the last 6 months or so, quite honestly, it started with Donald Trump talking about it out on the campaign trail in New Hampshire and these overdoses, and you see now on CNN and Fox News and a lot of the newspapers, I think a lot of people are picking up on it. But Scott, if you can explain to us what actually creates the heroin overdose, ultimately leading to death.
Well, what happens is, the thing is, what we have to really understand is that people aren't dying of heroin overdoses. They're dying of fentanyl and synthetic opioid death. And that's the scary part, because I always say things are going to get worse before they get better. So as we start addressing the prescription medication, because we're living in an epidemic of big pharma. That's where it's all happening, and the end result is the heroin. And once you start going to the street, it's Russian roulette. You don't know what you're getting, and it's all about potency because of the buildup of tolerance that most people have. So as they want a stronger drug. So they're introduced to the heroin. The heroin is laced with synthetics, and what happens is it represses the ability to breathe, basically. So through that, you'll start seeing someone what they call nod off, and they'll get to a point where they're only taking maybe 2 to 3 breaths every minute. So now, we get to the point where, we have to call, the EMS or first responders are very busy in responding to these types of emergency calls.
Doug, I want to come full circle, ask Scott a couple more questions, and then finish up with anything you may want to ask. But again, if you go to the firm website, fb-firm.com, or Doug, you'll put up my Twitter account. We push a lot of information about substance abuse prevention. I'm wearing more of my counselor hat as opposed to the attorney on that aspect, just getting out good information to people. But again, as graduation and prom approach, or if you may have a teenager in 9th or 8th, 10th grade that is dealing with these issues, again, I'm a parent, I have to have these discussions. We're trying to provide information from a legal standpoint and a counseling standpoint to help educate. So, Scott, to come full circle, we've touched on, alcohol, nicotine, the vaping, marijuana, the heroin. Where does the role of a parent fit in on this, and what would you recommend are the best steps for parents to have these discussions with their kids, assuming that you believe they should, and what can we do by way of prevention and education? Doug, the one thing that you and I discussed, we're trying to use the Facebook medium as a positive mechanism of getting out a good message.
Yep.
But, I will say this, when we sign off and I go back onto Facebook, I'm going to be looking at a lot of Sunday night trophies and everything's great. And we want to use this to really get out a good message. And that's why I had you on this show. So if you can just come full circle with that.
No, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I commend you on what you're trying to do with where you are as acting as a community leader with the knowledge that you have, because that's what it takes. It takes the community and the families within the communities, and that to understand that this isn't about my Johnny. This is about our kids. This is about our community. And one of the big things being an outreach specialist is put on a lot of community events, and it's very troubling. We just did one here in Novi recently, and we had the chief of the DEA, the FBI, HIDA, the police chief of Novi, the principal. We've done these in Northville as well and other communities, but you might get a handful of people, maybe 50 to maybe 100. And, people just aren't engaging. The community is just not engaging. They don't feel they have to engage until it happens to them, and then they don't think it's ever going to happen to them. But we have to take a perspective that this is about everybody. It's about our communities, our kids are everybody's kids. And like Lynn just says, it takes a village to raise a kid. It does. And we all have equity in that. So I think getting involved in advocacy, getting involved in your community and talking about this issue is so important. And, our kids are pretty smart. I mean, I say that facetiously but they are very smart for the resources that they have. And I think we just need to do a better job as parents keeping up with our kids and what's going on in their lives and having those conversations so they're willing to come to us to have those conversations and talk to us about them. And then us, there's this generational forgetting that we have, so we have to make sure that we understand today's issues. And I mean that from the perspective of not when I grew up. If I didn't work in this field, I'd be naive to a lot of the issues that are going on that our kids are experiencing today. And
we see it daily on the front lines.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to say that not only does it take a village to raise a kid, I think it takes a village to raise a village. I think it's everybody's responsibility in the village to make sure that the environment is generally, a safe environment. I think it's everybody's responsibility to contribute to, the whole scene. I think to try to make sure that everyone's on the same page about how serious this is.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I mean, our kids are the most vulnerable in this whole discussion. They are the most vulnerable, and they, in many ways, both physically, socially, and we need to be there for them. We need to protect them. I mean, just like this is unregulated legalization of marijuana, and if you look at it, I mean, you want your kid believing Santa Claus slings dope? I mean, who are they preying upon? They're preying upon our kids. And, if we don't take a stand and just expect better, I can go into a whole bunch of other examples. I mean, look at where your kids are going on the internet. Look at the application apps that they're downloading. And a lot of it has to do, with the socialization aspect of the social norming of not only drugs, but of many other aspects that kids are exposed to younger and younger.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. That was excellent.
Yeah. Hey,
this guy's a great man.
No,
it's been wonderful.
I have a lot to thank Mark for, and I'm very appreciative for what he's doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. Actually, and you know what? I just want to ask one more question too. To your point, Scott, when you say, well, hey, Mark says it's really important what you're doing, and you say, well, it's really important, Mark, what you're doing on this end. Mark, talk a little bit about on the back end where your role is on this as a counselor, as an attorney, and how you guys work together, and where you come in on the front lines of this crisis.
Well, that's why we're on Facebook today discussing it, because unfortunately, I'm really coming too late. They're coming to my office, whether we're talking teenagers or adults, after they've already been charged. And, we've said this in the past, you and I, but I'm picking up the pieces. So often, 95% of who's coming into my office is probably has some form of responsibility or guilt. Police officers do a good job out there. And I'm putting the pieces back together. So I'm on the phone calling up Scott, and I'm having conversations with parents about the naiveness of how they got into the situation in the first place. The red flags were ignored. And what I'm trying to do is give them a support network, whether it's through Scott Macy or other therapists and counselors, to educate them, put them back on the right path, explain to them throughout the court process what to expect. When we started off the show, we just briefly touched on the MIP. And if you're here in the Northville, Plymouth, Canton, Novi, South Lyon area, and you get caught at one of these graduation parties this summer and you get charged with an MIP, you can expect to be tested for the next year. I'm amazed how shocked they are about it. The ambivalence of not wanting to deal with the issues, or that it's not an issue. And often it leads to them coming back as a result of violating probation. And we can only do so much, but that's why we wanted to have Scott on the show, to try to get out in front of it from that standpoint.
Yeah. And if I could just, piggyback on what Mark is saying. I mean, we deal a lot with stigma and barriers for people to get help and to discuss this issue. And I think with the responsibility of the position that Mark holds as a lawyer, as a counselor, and to have this discussion, it just needs to be done more and more. And that's why I commend Mark for what he does. And I know, struggling through my addiction and putting back the pieces that I had to put back, I was very fortunate to have his guidance during that very vulnerable stage and very tough period.
Good stuff.
Specifically as it relates to the Facebook live stream today, in the words that I started off with, if Facebook had less arrogance, ignorance, and invincibility posted and more humility and vulnerability, I think it'd be a good start.
Good way to end the show, I think. Good words to leave everybody with.
All right.
So,
thank you, Doug.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, guys. I think this was really informative. Thank you to the live audience who was here today. And for those of you that joined in and participated and asked questions, got us with a pretty good dialogue going. And as you guys know, and as we stated before, for those of you who are still watching this at the end of the replay, feel free to share this out, ask questions. The chat continues after the broadcast is over. So the information is here on how you can reach these gentlemen, how you can participate, how you can get involved, how you can educate yourself and be a voice for change and try to help improve the situation. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I know I learned a lot. And thanks to both of you, Scott and Mark.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Have a great day.